we don't name these podcasts the same name as scripts, but this week's first commentary, lack of intelligence. And we put a question mark on it. I don't know at this point that question mark is really necessary anymore. But of course, that was about this pullout of Afghanistan. Joe Biden came to town and talked to the media and explained that this pullout, no mistakes were made. He was asked by George Stephanopoulos, and of course that was after we wrote this script.
Before we get too far, this is This Week in Common Sense, starring Paul Jacob. My name is Timothy Virkala, and on this podcast, done nearly every weekend, we discuss the big stories of the week that have appeared at thisiscommonsense.org. Now, back to Paul.
But now we know that he's not complaining about anything or disappointed with anything that's happened. It's just the way it was going to happen, no matter how you did it. And it's interesting because, as I point out in the script, I think we've been in Afghanistan too long. I do think we had a justifiable reason to go to Afghanistan. The people who bombed drove planes into the Twin Towers and into the Pentagon. And because of some bravery of regular folks, into the ground in Pennsylvania, thank goodness, although everybody on the plane died. So they were heroes, but they're no longer with us, unfortunately. But so we had every reason to go there. We didn't have every reason to stay there. And I think people can argue that back and forth. But it is true that from the polling I've seen, most people think we've been there too long and we ought to leave. But I don't think they had this in mind. And it's somewhat baffling to think that Joe Biden and the folks around him, who, of course, you could kind of see with, had Trump been president, he doesn't get along so well with the deep state, maybe the intelligence, there was some lack of communication. He hasn't been in Washington for 50 years, being vice president or a senator on the Foreign Relations Committee. He might make mistakes, but this is Mr. Experience. And he's got seasoned hands around him. And yet this just strikes me as insane, the way that it has been done. And what's more, his explanation of it, I think that the word I have in mind you can just use the initials, which are B and S. It's like he a month ago to suggest that this could be like Saigon in 1975 is insane. What are you talking about? That's crazy. And yet it turns out to be exactly like that. And then when it does turn out to be almost exactly like that, he says, we knew all along there was no other way to do it. You couldn't leave after 5 years. You couldn't have left 5 years ago. You couldn't leave at any time. You could stay there another 10 years. You could never get out any better than this. And that does not pass the smell test. Now I've heard, I have a friend who's definitely on the D side, who said, hey, people in Afghanistan were told they should get out weeks ago. And, I don't doubt that maybe there was some communication, but of course, if they then listened to Joe Biden, the president of the United States, give a speech, they would have thought, well, hey, there's no big deal. The Taliban isn't going to take the whole country. And of course now, and this isn't all in the script, because of course that was Monday. We're taping this on Friday, the 20th of August. And, there's been changes, but he now is saying, well, everybody knew, at least we thought it would last until the end of the year. Well, before this chaos in Kabul, nobody was, he didn't come out and say, hey, no problem, we've got until the end of the year. And when someone says, gee, I don't think it's going to all go to hell right away, it's not going to go to hell until the end of the year. Well, we're at the end of August. There's September, in October, and November, and December. So you didn't think it was going to go to hell in 11 days. You thought 4 months. But that would have been nice to communicate to people, or not. And see, that's part of it too, is why are we giving dates? Why do we say, hey, at this time, our troops will be leaving at 2:03 p.m. on the 20th of August? This is not ready for prime time. And yet, a lot of the world depends on the United States. And one of the things that regular readers of common sense will probably appreciate, certainly concur. We talk a lot now about China, about Taiwan, which is kind of after the Chinese have strangled Hong Kong, is kind of next on their hit list. And of course, Taiwan came up again and again and again. And not so much, I think, because of withdrawing from Afghanistan, but because we withdrew like we're bumpkins, and like we don't know what's going on, and like we lost to the Taliban. And frankly, we could send troops in and beat up the Taliban anytime we want. The problem is we don't have an underlying country that we can fix up and then ever seem to get out. So it seems like you take that into account and you get out in a much, much more careful way. But it's this week, the Global Times, which is the mouthpiece of the CCP, the Chinese government, they basically said, well, hey, Afghanistan's every bit as strategic as Taiwan. And, look how America just cut and run. And of course, there are huge differences between Taiwan and Afghanistan from just a strategic standpoint. Taiwan is 100 miles off the coast of China, is what, if it was somehow taken by China, would separate Japan and South Korea from the rest of Southeast Asia. It's hugely strategically important. But the biggest difference is that it's a free society. It's not a land that's never really been cohesively a nation, although actually before the Soviets got to Afghanistan and before we got to Afghanistan, it seemed to have a more functional government. Now, some of that was a royal family back in the 70s, the 60s. But this geopolitical mistake, nightmare, does have ramifications. And it seems to me that, and I've, in recent years, as I've started to focus more on China, because I personally see China as I believe someone would rightfully have seen Nazi Germany in 1933 and 35 and 36. I'm very concerned about China, and I have oftentimes called Taiwan the Sudetenland, or compared it to the Sudetenland, because my whole life I've been a non-interventionist, and of course I think when people have alliances and they've got each other's back, I don't consider that intervention. I consider that working together in an alliance. And if my neighbor says, "Hey, would you come over and help me with something?" I'm not intervening. I'm helping. So working together as free countries, and this is something that Tsai Ing-wen, the president of Taiwan, called for about a year ago, that free societies should be working together. And I have been very critical of our world policeman role, where we're going to do everything for everyone, because we can't fulfill it. And people are depending on us to do what we say we're going to do. So let's not say we can do things we can't do. And libertarians, at least Libertarian Party and people who use the libertarian word most often, tend to be extremely non-interventionist to the extent of we ought to have no alliances. You know, there's the old line by, I believe it was Washington, if not, it was Jefferson. If you go on the internet, who knows who it is, but it was basically friendship, you know, with everybody, entangling alliances with no one. And we see World War One, where all these entangling alliances and treaties created a world war. And then we see World War Two, where the lack of France and Britain coming to check Germany allowed Germany to get ahead of steam up that was absolutely devastating to millions of people. So I have become much more interested in a coalition of free countries where we are keeping people free. And so I'd like to see us aligned and working with Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Australia, because frankly, if China aggresses against Taiwan and the rest of the world, and it's really us, I mean, Germany, France, England, they've all sent ships to the South China Sea. It's not just Taiwan. It's also that China's claiming the entire South China Sea. Well, you know, Vietnam's there, and so is the Philippines and Indonesia and these other countries that have no ability to withstand China any more than before World War II, they had the ability to withstand Imperial Japan. And so these countries have begun to step up against China. It's good to see, but it's the sort of thing that to me, it's not as simply as easy as we withdraw. Because if the US completely withdraws from Southeast Asia, I think we have a world in which nobody is free for very long in Asia. And that's a huge problem. And I think it does come back to us at some point in the same way that I think in World War II, it's the sort of thing where we kind of moved sooner, it would have been better for millions of people. And I'm not really arguing that we should have moved before Pearl Harbor. It's just that if you look back, and of course we did move in all kinds of ways. We were giving resources and other things to England and allies. So it's not as if we were completely, you know, we won't do anything. But it seems to me that strength is not a bad thing. It's not. Our foreign policy has been bad and worse and terrible in all kinds of ways. We have tended to throw our weight around when we have, you know, we don't have any right because we're stronger to beat people up. That's not what the United States of America is about. It's never what the public has wanted. And I think our leaders have not been very thoughtful. They've been thoughtful in terms of what would big business want to happen, but not so much what would free people want to happen. But at the same time, being weak is not helpful for folks. Having China where there is zero freedom unless you say what the Chinese want you to say is a huge threat. And frankly, Russia is not nearly as capable as China, but they have all the same bad intentions, and of course have occupied part of Ukraine. They've taken I'm going to say Crimea. I wanted to say some other word, but and so, you know, we've got bad actors out there, and it seems to me that if we want to get to a place where we're not the world's policeman, the way to do it is not to just kind of turn over the board and go home. The way to do it is to start to talk to other countries who also value freedom, who have the same values, and let's work together, because, you know, at some point we may need them. They need us. And it seems to me that my view, and I'm not going to conscript anybody to follow this view. And I don't think I have a right to somehow, take over the US government and force it to do this. I think that the public ought to make the ultimate decision of what we're willing to do or not willing to do when it comes to world affairs. But I would vote for forming solid, sensible, real world alliances with people where they put in and we put in, where we're not paying for everything and doing everything, and the superpower, because superpower is a term I hate. It's a lie. We're no superpower. We're not supermen. And the more we pretend that we are, the more we get ourselves in trouble. And frankly, the more we get other people in trouble because they're depending on us to do stuff that we maybe don't intend to do. And so I am looking for the US to radically change its foreign policy in the sense of real agreements with other people, real alliances, and having allies is not so when we do something we can create a letterhead, here's all the countries that are on board. It's to actually work with them and figure out in their region what's the best way to keep open navigation of the seas. That's in everybody's interest. So I went on a long little jaunt here that's not all in this piece, but I encourage you to go to thisiscommonsense.org. It's called The Lack of Intelligence. And it just suggests that we have screwed up the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and that we ought to recognize that the biggest problem with what we're trying to do in Afghanistan is that we don't have a free society that we're trying to protect. We have a society that's not free, that doesn't seem to have the building blocks for that. And that's been a real problem. And we need to be aware of that. And when you think about other places, I think we ought to not defend dictators, whether it's in the Middle East or in Asia or in Europe or anywhere else. And we ought to be working with free countries to work together and in a real way together, which will be cheaper for us, but also has the ability, I think, to keep monstrous evil like the CCP in China in check.
Now, Afghanistan is not far from China.
It borders.
Yeah, a very small,
Tiny.
weird little border.
Yes.
On sort of an isthmus of borders. But I don't know what kind of terrain that is either. Is that a river valley that goes through there?
It may be a river valley, but it's surrounded by very, very mountainous territory.
Yeah.
So it's not the sort of thing where where it's an easy land border where China's going to rush in with troops into Afghanistan.
I read a number of articles about how much mineral wealth that Afghanistan has, and that China may be licking its chops for that. Now, my concern, partly with your discussion of what America needs to do, is about China and not about Afghanistan. So you did clean it up at the end where you explained that the problem there was we weren't defending a free society. We were basically retaliating against and apparently trying to incapacitate an unfree society that had allied with our attackers. Now that makes sense, going after them, but we should remember that Afghanistan was gone into by the Bush administration, I think, as a lost leader. They had no interest in Afghanistan. The interest of George Walker Bush was to go to Iraq.
And yes, and let's say George W. And of course, I think Walker is what it is, but what that middle name is. But some people might get confused because sometimes they talk about George H.W. Bush and Walker gets used in that. But he basically did the same thing in Afghanistan as Iraq, that he went in and basically bought the place, didn't buy it, but invaded and took it and was going to nation build. And of course, this is right after he runs for president saying no nation building.
Right.
His critique of foreign policy before that was that we were stupid to be trying to nation build, and then did it two places.
Very badly. And I think the reason is because the what's the biblical metaphor is that it was barren ground, is that it's not a place that we can nation build. There was only one way to nation build in Afghanistan, and we would never do it because it would be evil by our standards. And that is, you kill every male and you bring in people from America and make all the women their wives and ban Islam. That would do it. That would be a success. But no one in America would even contemplate that because it's way beyond our vision of the world. But that's how a conqueror would do it. What we may have done something interesting, though, is that we may have consolidated the power of the Taliban. The Taliban, the Afghanistan, the current government that we'd been propping up and so forth, just caved to it. Just let them in. Was very little fighting from what I understand. The Taliban may now be stronger than it ever would have been had we not attacked them. Because as we know, one of the ways that you can consolidate power in a country is to have an enemy, and they just defeated the biggest enemy in the world. So we may have created a new centralized government in Afghanistan that will work. Not to our liking, but will work.
And they have largely consolidated power throughout the country, which is something they did not have when we invaded. They never really controlled the northern region. That's why the Northern Alliance, which was a bunch of warlords who put together an army, basically, was fighting the Taliban. So we have done some bad things there. Bush, who said, look, the buck stops here, and then blamed everybody else, which is the opposite of the buck stopping there.
But that's what Biden is doing, and that's what Obama did, and that's what Trump did. So that is an American tradition now, right?
Yes, but it's always funny that it's kind of like to say that it's one thing to just blame everybody and finger point, but it's another thing to say the buck stops here before you start doing it. Kind of as a precursor. I want to lie to you, bald face, before I say the next thing. But there's a figure that I saw in the Washington Post and I'd heard on television of 66,000 Afghans who had died in this 20-year war. That's soldiers and police. And I heard somebody argue that it was like 50,000 soldiers and the rest, the 16,000, were police. That surprised me. And I try to keep up. And I don't think it's that there were lots of stories in the papers and on TV about the Afghans dying in the field against the Taliban. I think that we just didn't hear about that. And it strikes me as something that we ought to hear about. And I was kind of, when Biden says, oh, they just crumpled like a cheap suit, it's easy to believe that. I remember in Iraq, when George W. was about to go to war, on TV, they kept saying, well, the Iraqi army is the fourth largest army in the world. And, I just thought, give me a break. Just because you've conscripted a bunch of, 16-year-olds who have a wooden stick instead of a rifle, that's not an army. And of course, they folded pretty quickly. And they had, maybe more advanced professionalized units and stuff, but they seemed to fold pretty quickly too. So it's believable, I think, for Americans that the Afghan army just evaporated in the field and refused to fight. I'm not sure that's the reality. And when you hear that kind of death toll, I mean, there were 2,300 Americans who were killed. It's pretty obvious that somebody was willing to fight. And so I think part of the problem is the American public doesn't get good information about what's going on. We watch on our TV screens of, some Afghan mother handing a baby over to Marines. And, you understand the implications of that and your heart just breaks. But it's in a land that even though we've been there for 2 decades, we don't know anything about. And I, years ago, years after the end of the Vietnam War, read Stanley Karnow's book, which was a companion to a PBS series about Vietnam. And it seemed like the first 7,500 pages of the book were Vietnamese history. And I remember starting to read it and thinking, oh, this is good because I don't know anything. I don't know anything about Vietnamese history. Now, how do you go to war with a country and know nothing about it? Well, you do that if you think everything is firepower and we've got better machines. And so we're going to win because we're just going to bomb everything and throw more troops at it and more technology and somehow they're primitive peoples that we can just overrun. Well, we find out again and again, they're people like us, and they may be more primitive, but somehow our thinking oftentimes seems pretty primitive. And of course, if you know the history of Vietnam, you know that they were constantly invaded. And unlike a lot of places that are constantly invaded, they constantly fought. And so the idea of Vietnam throwing out the French and then ultimately throwing out the Americans, if you know Vietnamese history, is not so crazy. But it was, I think, a shock to us because we don't know anything. And we have to own that ourselves. But why do we have this huge media apparatus if they don't ever tell us anything? What is the point? They're constantly telling us stuff, but they don't seem to be telling us important stuff that we ought to know. and maybe that is a segue because we're going to have more fallout from Afghanistan. I think the big picture is that wherever you are on what policy we should have in Afghanistan, this pullout was a mess and shows the kind of just chutzpah and arrogance that is awfully dangerous. Even if you were a superpower, and I'm convinced there are no superpowers, even if we were, it's the way that even a superpower could screw everything up. So that's a huge problem.
So when you were talking about a segue, were you talking about another one of your commentaries from this week?
Were there 5 days this week?
Yeah.
Yes. Conspirators versus conspiracists. And the idea that we don't get the information we ought to get. This is a piece, and we won't go into quite as much depth on it, but this is a piece about a study that Google did, detecting conspiracy theories on social media. And they looked at 4 different conspiracy theories. One of them, which tells you all you need to know, was the Wuhan lab leak. See, that was a conspiracy theory. The theory was that somehow this could have leaked from the Wuhan lab. How crazy. And of course, what happened? Well, social media, the US government, big government science folks denied it, conspired.
Not that conspiracy. It was a public fraud. That is the case.
Yes.
What was his name? Daszak?
Daszak. Yes, Peter Daszak. And it was facilitated by Anthony Fauci. He was involved. We see the emails. So it was a conspiracy to close down discussion of a lab leak from Wuhan. And social media, Facebook, announced when it all kind of went south that they were going to stop censoring statements and posts and information about the lab leak. So their study is crap. Their study about somehow detecting conspiracy theories. Here's the reality. Oftentimes, someone comes up with a conspiracy theory. They think the people have conspired to do this or that. They're wrong. Well, you know what? Sometimes people are wrong, but sometimes they're right. And there was a conspiracy. So this idea that the media can just, and I'm talking about the broader, not just the New York Times and the Washington Post, but Facebook and Twitter and YouTube, social media, they can conspire and do and have. And the lab leak is proof positive of it. And again, we're not saying, oh, we know for sure it was a lab leak. We believe that it was a lab leak because we, just believe things for the heck of it. But there's a lot of evidence a lot of circumstantial evidence, not smoking gun evidence, but circumstantial evidence that it was a lab leak. And of course, if we pointed out in other scripts, there's almost no evidence that it came zoonotically from animals. And the whole argument for it coming from animals was that's how others have come. Well, that's not evidence. That's kind of a, hey, if we were to guess, here's a rationale for us guessing this way.
And there are scientists who from the beginning said that this virus looked manufactured. I mean, we have to remember this was something right from the beginning. I remember in February hearing major virologists say this is not right. And now many of them may have been cranks. I don't know. I there's so much about this I don't know, but we knew from the beginning also, since it came in Wuhan, and then we discovered almost immediately, oh, there are two virology labs, and it turns out one of them had been funded in part, a small part, by the U.S. government. I think that we should regard it as a possibility that this is worse than you suggest. I mean, you make a fairly rational case for just a leak. I don't think it was a leak. I think that if it came from the Wuhan lab, it is just as likely to have been in some sense planned.
When people first mentioned, like Tom Cotton, senator from Arkansas, Republican, said this could be a lab leak, it was immediately he's suggesting this was a bioweapon, and he never suggested it.
I suggested, yeah.
But that's the thing. Well, we now know, one, we know that Fauci in February, from the emails that have been released, we know he was told by a scientist that this looks like a manufactured virus. We also now know that at the Wuhan lab, they set up, and people have argued using US funds, using your and my money, they set up a department, an area where they were doing, where the military controlled it, the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, which aren't really for the people and don't liberate, but they are an army. And so they were doing military research there. So there's, and again, that doesn't mean, okay, we know for sure. We don't. But why do we have to not even think about it? As if China somehow, the same people who are doing a genocide in Xinjiang province and have clamped down and arrested people for, saying I like democracy, and they might go to prison for life in Hong Kong, and are threatening to invade Taiwan. Why do we want to we would never suggest that they might, have a bioweapon? I think if they had a really good bioweapon, they're the type of regime that would use it. So anyway.
This isn't a very good bioweapon, by the way. If you're trying to kill lots of people, it's a great bioweapon if you're trying to take over people's minds. Because if the purpose is psychological and not crude, not just kill lots of people. Because the problem with onion disease, and that's a problem always has been with bioweaponry, is that it's very hard to control the disease. And we're finding out really quite obviously that we can't control the disease very well. Masks don't work in the way we think they work. We can see no evidence from the graphs of the contagion over time from country to country with mask mandate versus lockdowns. You can't see any pattern to it. That virus is just doing what it's doing. So that means that bioweaponry is dangerous for the country that engages in it, right? So why would you do it? Oh, what you would want to do, if you're going to do it, is create a low-grade virus that then you can use as a psychological warfare technique to undermine your enemies. And I can't think of anything more undermined than the West right now. I think everybody's heads are completely messed up. They don't know how to deal with the threat. They won't think of it as a threat, just as a menace that's, natural and blah, blah, blah. That's all nonsense because they're not thinking in terms where they might have to be courageous.
It's the number one problem with the world from day one is a lack of courage. Lack of integrity is maybe the bigger problem, but those are really oftentimes tied together. So but when you step back and it really doesn't matter the specifics of this, what we see is that we don't get good information. We don't get the truth. And if we want to have a society in which citizens control their government, then the citizens can't be kept in the dark all the time. And that, to me, that's the scariest thing. If you're not upset with Biden, regardless of where you are on this, because what he says doesn't make sense with what he said before. Wait a second, you're not telling us the truth. If you're not upset with Facebook, because it's not just that, oh, they censored something I like. If they censor something I don't like, it means I live in a world where I'm not going to hear what people are saying. That's not the world we want. And it's just a huge problem. And I'm going to, let's skip over subliminal morality, which was Wednesday's script, and we're going to come back to that. But we ought to talk about the vaccine passports in New York City. And on Thursday, we had ceding science to totalitarians. And this time we're not talking about Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party. We're talking about Bill de Blasio and New York City. And basically, New York City now has a vaccine passport. 25% of the city has been told they can't go to any stores. They can't basically live their lives in any way, shape, or form. I don't know how they survive unless their vaccinated neighbors will maybe come feed them scraps of food or something. It's and you know, people can have different views of whether they want to be vaccinated or they don't want to be vaccinated. But this idea that the moment that the government tells you you have to stick some needle in your arm, we're living in a totalitarian-esque society. And Bill de Blasio, always going to, you know, one of the far left folks who's going to talk about what a racist country we are. Well, guess who is disproportionately impacted on this? It's Black folks in New York City. And we've talked before about how, you know, the Trump people and the folks in, you know, the South, people in the South aren't as vaccinated. And that's Trump country, and it's all these right wingers and you know, just heaping scorn on them, as if somehow, boy, that's a good way to persuade them to vaccinate, but never mentioning that Black folks, if you look on a racial thing, they are the most unvaccinated. Now, part of it is that I think people say, well, I understand why they don't trust the medical community, which I kind of think, well, have you had a second thought about that? Because if Black folks have reason not to trust the medical community, then you and I have reason not to trust the medical community. In other words, if the medical community could do something really bad to Black folks and has, well, then you think that they're always these evil doers are never going to hurt you, just Black folks? Well, I think that we have reason to be skeptical, everyone. And I think we have reason to say you cannot outlaw people from going to the store. You cannot say that our society is run in such a way that if you don't put a shot in your arm, you don't get to go to the store. And look, I say this knowing that huge segment of this country, maybe a majority, is so scared about this virus killing everyone, even though its lethality is not quite that. But they're so frightened that they want the government to tell everyone what to do and control everyone in this totalitarian type way. There was a Peace and Reason, great libertarian outfit, and we often talk about their pieces, almost always lauding them, but not always. And this is a case in which, while their take on this was that these vaccine mandates are not very workable, because that's one of the things they pointed out in the article, is that a lot of places aren't checking, but also, you know, they didn't like the you know, big government aspect of it. but they did seem to fall right in line with the official science and not address some of the things about other scientists who are saying these mask mandates are of no value. There's a lot of disagreement about whether the masks are really doing much of anything to help. And I think what a lot of folks have said is viruses are contagious. They aren't easily stopped. They're very, very tiny. They mutate. They do all kinds of things. It's not as if we have just willy-nilly wiped out viruses all the time. And especially a coronavirus like this is similar to the common cold. And there's a Z-Dog who's a MD on who I kind of like. I don't agree with him completely, but like him on YouTube. If it's ZDOGG, have you seen him?
I don't think I have.
He's pro-vaccine, but he's not. He's kind of said, look, over time, people getting it is a good thing because that's how we get these. He says this will become endemic instead of a pandemic, and that we ought to be looking for that. And he's talked about like the boosters, that everybody probably doesn't need a booster, but some people who are vulnerable may want to have it. So he's in line with a lot of the pro-vaccine arguments, but has been much more common sense and stop panicking. Because look, in any difficult situation, the worst thing to do is panic. And yet it seems like our government and our media, I repeat myself, is urging panic, demanding panic, and embracing panic. They want us panicked. And look, people die. And that's a serious thing. But people die all the time. We can't just cut off our heads and run around. That's not going to help. So it does seem to me that, again, the biggest problem, like I've gotten my first shot of Pfizer. I'm supposed to get the second one within a time frame here. I'm probably going to do it. I want to be able to travel outside the country in a couple months and other things. But I have to say, I told my wife after I got my first shot, I thought I'd feel kind of relieved. I didn't feel relieved at all. And the reason I don't feel relieved at all, it's not that I think, oh, these vaccines are secret drugs or they're going to kill me, but they might. And if they were going to, or if they were as dangerous as some people have said, would I be told? Would the media cover it? No, probably not. So when you live in a society in which you can't trust what you're being told, it gets really scary. And that to me is the biggest problem we have when you start censoring and silencing people. All of a sudden, this robust discussion and search for truth becomes somebody, force feeding things that you realize are not all true. And if everything they said were a lie, it'd be easy. It'd be easy to say, oh, well, they said that, let's do the opposite. But we now live in a society in which we're being told truth with lies, and we're not giving our years ago, there was this book, The Wisdom of Crowds, and how, if everybody can weigh in on something, there's a wealth of information and perspective that we can all benefit from. Once that gets hijacked and it's all official truth and what the medical experts say, we're sunk. And that's why I don't feel better getting vaccinated. I feel concerned. I feel like I've taken a step where I don't have good information. And don't get me wrong, I'm not walking around all day all nervous because, it's life. What can you do? And because I know people in the medical field, one of the reasons I decided to get vaccinated is I had friends who were doctors who said, I think this Delta variant's a real concern. It is something where it's probably going to protect you. but all along, I had COVID. Lots of people have had COVID. And I think that, wait, aren't these natural antibodies going to be good? Maybe even better than the vaccine? Maybe not. And it's not as if I don't feel like I know. And part of it is I feel like the big science doesn't want that question asked or answered. They just want everyone to take the shot. They just want everyone to shut up and do what they're told. And that tells me I live in a dangerous world.
And if anyone was concerned about how dangerous it can get, we're just seeing it implemented. That's these vaccine passports in New York and in California. But in Australia and New Zealand, New Zealand just locked down again.
Over one case.
One case. We live in a world of stupid people. Okay, that's stupid. There's nothing to justify that. These people are crazy. And the
yes.
person in charge, and whatever that woman's name is, I can never remember her name. It's an odd name. In New Zealand, that woman is as well. I consider that level of stupidity to be evil. And Australia is engaging in rounding up children. I've seen lots of. This is an amazing thing what's happening in Australia. There are beatings. Police are beating children. I've seen videos of children being pepper sprayed by police for not wearing their masks correctly. We're living in a totalitarian society down there. But it's also a lot of the people are liking it too. They're building concentration camps. They're calling them something else, something very nice and medical, but they're concentration camps. They're building them, and there are lots of support for it.
Whoa.
Yeah. Look at that stuff. Did you see all that? I gave you an info dump the other day.
Okay.
is really going down a hole that is faster than us. They're heading towards totalitarianism faster than America, and Americans should look at it carefully before they decide they want to follow Bill de Blasio and his crazy notion. And by the way, I like your basic take about not getting enough information. I think we have enough information not to take the vaccines, but that's because I've read and listened to a lot of people who are not approved.
Well, and these ones that we link to, people could say they're nuts, but these are very accomplished scientists and researchers and so on who, it's worth hearing what they say. And again, I'm not a doctor. I'm not saying, gee, I know. I'm saying I want a system in which people aren't shut up. People aren't blocked from saying things, because that's the only way that people like you and me, and I'm talking to most folks out there, where we didn't go to med school. We haven't done our own research. We don't have a lab in the basement. And we want better information. We want to hear it all. And the only way you kind of feel comfortable that you've reached the truth is that you've been able to look at all the information. So that's again and again the problem.
This week, earlier in the week, we had a quotation from Jonathan Haidt, who made your point. His point is, the easy way to tell which side is wrong, it's the side that shoots its dissidents. If they do that, you can pretty much count on the fact that they are wrong. And he was using shoot dissidents as a metaphor also for basically anyone who tramps on freedom of speech. He says,
Yes.
The people who are wrong, but the people who support trampling free speech, who are basically against free speech, who suppress dissident opinion. And it's not just shooting dissidents, it's actually preventing them from speaking in public. And that's what these people are doing.
We've got two more commentaries. One that is along these same lines. It's called The Lurid Latest, and it's about Ilhan Omar, the Minnesota Democrat congresswoman. And there's a group there in Minnesota, individual who's done all this research because, of course, she's been accused of marrying her brother in order to bring him in as a refugee, immigrant, whatever, through the marriage entry ability. And so I don't know if the allegation is that she really married her brother, except on paper. But of course, that's a crime. Um, and so it's not a good thing for Congress people to do or anyone to do. Um, and it's obviously fraud if it was done just for that reason, and it's incest if it wasn't done just for that reason. So, but what strikes me as so funny here, and it's a lurid tale, and I'm not going to go into all the details. So you can go to thisiscommonsense.org and look up the lurid latest. But the individual who Anton Lazaro, who spent thousands of dollars to do DNA. They ran down a cigarette and a straw from her and from her brother, and they confirmed that 99.99998% likelihood that they are related. But then he was arrested on sex trafficking charges. Hasn't yet pled or well, he says he's innocent, but that case is really not going anywhere. But it shut down his website for a little bit. Anyway, you can read all about it. But the upshot is, it strikes me that this story has always been pretty interesting to me, because if Congress people are committing immigration fraud, that's a story. And the media has kind of looked into it, but she's not been helpful. And maybe there's no way she could be helpful other than to give a DNA sample. And I could kind of understand why someone doesn't want to give a DNA sample. I have this strong feeling that if she were a Republican, that the media would hound her until I knew more about it. And because she is kind of a communist Democrat, and I don't say that flippantly, that they don't seem to want to look into her. And I don't know if it somehow, she's a woman, she's a person of color, therefore they don't look into it. And she's I think the key is she's a Democrat. But anyway, I want to know a lot more about this case. And that's the reason that I wrote this is, why don't we know more? And again, from medical stuff to foreign policy to just bad behavior potentially of a member of Congress. And it's like sometimes we're given all this information about stories that we wonder how important is it, and other times you want information and it's just crickets. But let's close out with Wednesday's commentary. I wrote subliminal, but it's not subliminal. It's subminimal morality. And this is a story about an individual who is mentally challenged, and he's working. He's making only $3.40 an hour. And the Congress is looking at fixing this problem. And how they would fix it is to get rid of this sub-minimal minimum wage. It allows, when someone has mental or physical disabilities, it allows an employer to pay them less. And some people can look at this and have looked at it. We had a long discussion. A friend of mine who sees it the other way, who basically said this is exploiting these people. And
that's what all employment is. You exploit me, I exploit you. That's what it is. What he means is it's bad exploitation. Why? Because they're less skilled?
This is taking advantage of people who are disabled. And I have a totally different look at it, because when I was a young man, I did some work with mentally challenged adults. And I found it's one of the reasons I always loved Special Olympics, is because I saw what joy it was for them to be able to compete, to be able to do something to show what they could do. And many of them worked for a employer that did mass mailings, fairly rote work that they were decent at. Maybe not as good as somebody else who wasn't as challenged, but they were pretty good at it, and they could make money at it, and it could make them independent in like a real way, not just their parents saying, oh, you're independent, I bought everything, here's, because a lot of them were living with friends, others not at home, some of them were still living at home, but they liked being independent and they liked being productive, and it mattered everything to them. And it wasn't just that they got to make money and live, because most of them, their parents would have taken care of them as long as they lived anyway. And somebody suggested in a comment on this piece that well, this is why we need the basic income, because then they could have the basic income and the minimum wage would be unimportant. But of course, that misses the whole point. These people are not asking for someone to just write them a check. They want to do, they want to achieve, they want to do all the things that you and I get our self-esteem from. They'd like some self-esteem, and they deserve it because they're human beings. And it's like, to me, the idea of shutting this down and making these people more wards of the state or their parents or whatever is criminal. It is evil. It is wrong. We just can't do that to people. And of course, it implicates the whole minimum wage, because the whole minimum wage idea is that somehow we have to create this floor, because otherwise people will work for money that by the end of the week they starve to death. Now, we haven't seen the stats on starvation, but the truth is, if you, wherever you set that floor, anyone who is not experienced enough, not talented enough, not able enough to produce at that level is kicked out, is out of the process. And that is a crime against them. Now, I could argue it's a crime against the employer for not being able to make whatever contract with other people they want to make, and it is. But it's not the same. I know people and they're all, well, but the employers can afford it or whatever. And so it seems to me it's such a great example to say, here's a case in which we all can recognize this person is not going to produce $15 of value an hour. And so we can mandate that employers pay $15 an hour. But this person gets short shrift, gets kicked out of any productive life. And that is a crime against them and humanity, in my view. And so where do you draw the line? What about the kid who, maybe their parents didn't teach them anything. They went to school, they just got passed along year after year. They go for a job and the person says, this person's not going to be able to do this job, because I got all these people who I got to pay $15 an hour, and I've got people who are worth $15 an hour asking for the job. That person doesn't ever get their foot on the first rung of the ladder. And that is devastating. And then all of a sudden they're 34 and they haven't had any job. They've been on the dole this way or that way. And then they apply and you look at it and you say, well, they've got no work experience. So it's like, if they ever want to earn $15 an hour, or maybe 30 or 45 or $115 an hour, they got to get the first job. So it's this, thanks for helping, but please stop. And I just think this is a great way to look at it, because so many people have these experiences and they know that in these cases, you are not doing anyone a favor by setting the price of their labor higher than they can maintain. And I ask people who understand that, look at the bigger picture and realize that maybe someone who's not so mentally challenged or physically challenged or anything else, but just isn't at a place to make that minimum level, you are screwing them up too. And once you realize that, then let's look at something else. I'm convinced people are not going to work at a job that pays them $3 an hour if they can get another job over here for $15 an hour. So I'm not so worried about, some people have this idea that if we didn't have any minimum wage, that half the country would be working for 3 cents an hour and living, in hovels somewhere. Now we have the people living in the woods, but that's usually because we have so fixed and perfected housing regulations that they can't afford to live anywhere. That's the favor we're doing those people. Anyway, maybe we should talk more about this, because it's all this help is sure hurting a lot of people.
Well, the basic idea that people get paid something close to their marginal product, that is what they contribute to the enterprise, is something many people have a hard time grasping. They don't believe it is true. I mean, I think they don't believe it. They believe that people get paid what they can get away with, right? What everybody, and so they think everything's about what you can get away with, and that's their paranoid view of the world. And I don't think the paranoid view of the world applies in this case. I'm amazed that anyone can employ not very bright people to do mailings. It was a story you mentioned that one of your friends employed disabled people, or some people like that. Because I was in charge of a troop of really bright people that we had to do mailings quite often, and I could almost get no one to do it fast. It was like trying to speed up molasses. And I can take a label and put it off with one hand and onto the envelope really fast. I could go through. I don't know if I was double the speed of my interns, but I tell you, it was not easy getting smart people to do that kind of work. So maybe that's...
No, it's so funny you say that, because I have done so many mailings in my life, and I am fast. I am it's like, and I'm constantly, oh no, if I do it this way, if I put this piece in here, I can do it that much faster. And other folks they're talking and you'll go, well, if you'll do it faster this way, and then, oh yeah, and they're having a conversation, and I can talk and stuff the mail and fold it and put the stamp on and so on. But there's a little bit of an argument, I think, that these folks at $3.40 an hour may be better than the smart people at $15 an hour. So yes,
there might be cases like that, because maybe some of my interns were too smart for my own good.
Well, you didn't crack the whip enough, but sometimes it's tough to crack the whip on smart people to do the mailing faster, because then you feel like they may not be as nice when they're doing more complex things later, and you're asking them to write that piece really quickly, and they kind of, well, I don't know if I'm going to go so fast since you were cracking the whip a few minutes ago.
Well, I was complaining about interns especially, because they got paid almost nothing, so they were almost off the wages of the sub-minimals.
Well, that's true. That's true. And isn't it interesting that so many places, nonprofits, and I think other places where people take an internship, which I think is productive for them. It's a good deal for them if they can afford to do it. But these people who have all these interns not getting paid much are complaining about Walmart, which is paying more, or somebody else who wants the minimum wage. Someone who's running a restaurant, and labor costs are a huge part of their expense. And they don't seem to appreciate that sometimes that's more important. And yet then they take advantage and have people who are making sub minimum because the law is written that way. The best thing would be to get rid of all of it. And when you have, it's like when they complain about people, Walmart not paying enough. And I'm thinking, well, rather than complain, why don't you just go to Walmart and tell the people exactly where they can get a better job? Because my experience in the Walmarts around me is that sometimes you think, well, the folks at Walmart are a little rough, and then you point out, I'm not talking about the customers, I'm talking about the employees. And it is when people find ways to put us to work, that's good, as long as we have the freedom to say no. They're doing us a heck of a favor, because they're offering us something. and we can say yes or we can say no. And you know, I've worked these different jobs. I picked tobacco for one day, and then decided, you know what, I can find a better job than this. After one day, I remember sitting in the tub the next morning, just as sore as I could be, thinking, you know what, I think I could just go door to door to businesses in town and find a job, and I did.
So that concludes another episode of This Week in Common Sense starring Paul Jacob. I thank you for showing up. And if you really want to help us out, you can do things like click like, share with friends, go to the SoundCloud page, go to thisiscommonsense.org. You know, there's all sorts of things you can do to make sure that you hear us again and that others hear us for the first time. Thank you.